Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for APA Virginia's Your Hour webinar series. We're going to give everybody just a minute to get in and then we'll get rolling. All right, thank you everybody for joining us. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm sure a few more people jump on as we get going. But Your Hour with APA Virginia is our monthly webinar series, and we're glad you are able to join us on what is a short week for everybody for the Thanksgiving holiday. First and foremost, thank you to our sponsors that make this possible, the Berkeley Group. We would not be able to do this without you. We have a couple upcoming webinars. As you can see, and give me 1 second, from the screen, you can find all of our webinars on virginia.planning.org. We have webinars scheduled for December and January of 2020. December 16th, you will notice that while we normally host our webinars on the fourth Monday of every month, we've bumped it up a week because of the Christmas holiday. So please note that when you're scheduling it. December 16th, we'll be doing rural broadband, common misconceptions and current opportunities. Join rural broadband policy expert and entrepreneur Jimmy Carr for an informative overview of the rural broadband landscape. This webinar will review some of the key levers that policymakers can apply to drive broadband deployment in their communities and give you the tools to make better long-term decisions for broadband. Additionally, we've scheduled January's webinar, Community Conversations for Collaboration, Bridge Street Area Revitalization in Bedford, Virginia. The 2018 Bridge Street Area Plan focuses on revitalization of the town of Bedford's Centertown core. Human-centered design exercises facilitated conversations to bridge divides across the community, both physically and relationally. Using an EPA Brownfields grant, the project was directed by a citizen steering committee whose idea was to start the conversations. The outcome is a plan of implementation that seeks to build the community from the inside out to provide economic opportunity and quality of life for the downtown area and beyond. As all of our webinars are, both of these are eligible for 1 CM credit. Each month we record our webinars and then they're posted to our YouTube page. That can be found if you go to APA Virginia YouTube. This will be the page that comes up. Also, CM credits are available to watch the webinars recorded as well, and that CM identification number is posted in the comments under the recorded webinar. As always, if there is a certain topic that you all are interested in hearing about, please let us know. We always want feedback from our attendees. That information can be sent to admin@apavirginia.com. Again, admin@apavirginia.com. If you have any topics that you would like to see discussed or speakers that you would like to have us include. This week or this month, we're going to do a webinar called Mitigation Matters. Pew recently released research entitled Mitigation Matters, which identifies 13 states or cities that have adopted policies resulting in effective flood mitigation. These policy profiles, which span the nation, are organized into 3 categories: using existing funds for mitigation by redirecting revenue and spending, creating revenue sources, and establishing smarter regulations. I'm going to hand over my portion of the time now to Matt and Sarah. And just one housekeeping thing as we go through the presentation. please type all of your questions in the question box on your control panel, and then at the end of their presentation, we'll open it up to those questions. And Matt and Sarah, I am going to hand over the screen to you all, and then you can go from there. So thank you guys for being with us, and I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks so much. This is a really great opportunity to be talking with you. This is Matt Fuchs, an officer with Pew's Flood Prepared Communities Initiative. I am going to be telling you a bit about our Mitigation Matters research, which was released last week. And then we're also going to be talking a little later in the presentation about some policy initiatives on flood mitigation in Virginia. So just to set the table for talking about the research, tell you a little bit about Pew. Pew, the Pew Charitable Trusts, is an international nonprofit that uses evidence-based, nonpartisan analysis to solve today's policy challenges. And our Flood Prepared Communities Initiative focuses on reducing the economic and environmental impacts of flooding through reform in 4 areas. One is reforming the National Flood Insurance Program. Second is incorporating resilience into infrastructure. Third area is pre-disaster mitigation related to flooding. And the fourth area is using nature-based solutions whenever possible as an alternative to gray infrastructure. So I'm going to be focusing on pre-disaster mitigation, that third area that I mentioned, and specifically our research, just a little bit about mitigation itself. Mitigation of flooding and disasters is historically an underfunded priority of the government, even though we know that mitigation saves. So this map that you're looking at breaks down cost savings for disaster mitigation by state across the country. Nationally, every dollar invested in disaster mitigation saves an average of $6 in future costs. That's a stat from the National Institute of Building Sciences that was released through their research last year. And the map you're looking at was actually put together by our fiscal federalism initiative at Pew. So we know there are benefits. And although this is a historically underfunded priority, the federal government and states are both making strides in recent years to do more on flood mitigation. The federal government has taken some action in recent years, increasing the amount of money for pre-disaster mitigation available through federal grants. FEMA has recently launched a mitigation investment moonshot with the goal of quadrupling mitigation spending in public and private sectors by 2022. In 2018, last year, the president signed into law the Disaster Recovery and Reform Act, which dedicates a significant percentage of disaster-related spending and moves that money over to a pre-disaster mitigation pot for communities who want to do more when it comes to preparing for really bad storms. And even still, though, events are straining federal resources, and states and localities are looking for solutions. Flood-related disasters have cost over $845 billion in disasters since 2000. And these kinds of damages are leading states across the country, such as Tennessee, Texas, Virginia, and South Carolina, to actually, the governors in these states have announced mandates to do more with planning for disasters with a focus on flood mitigation. So we kept on hearing questions from officials who are increasingly recognizing that this is a problem for their communities. What are the really effective policies out there as far as ideas for doing more for flood mitigation at the state and local level, and what are some examples that have worked? And so we did this research called Mitigation Matters, and we set out to study solutions across the country. And what we found is, when it comes to mitigation, there is no one-size-fits-all solution. And so our research provides 13 state and local examples of policies across the country that have prompted more risk reduction activities or mitigation to help make communities more resilient. And we found that the policies fall into three categories. The first is using existing revenue to help pay for flood mitigation. So these are grants and rebates. Second category is creating new revenue sources. So in this category, we have taxes and fees. And then the third category is establishing smart regulations to help drive less risky development. So I'm going to talk about a few of the policies that we profiled in our research in each of those categories. So in the first category, using existing revenue for flood mitigation, we profiled Arkansas, South Holland, Illinois, a small town in Illinois called South Holland, Vermont state policy, Washington state, and Wisconsin state policy. The policy that we featured in Wisconsin is a grant program that the state has set up following a series of bad floods. This includes some really devastating flooding. For example, it occurred in August or the summer of 1993. Flooding across the Midwest, including Wisconsin, caused 50 deaths, $15 billion in damage. So to make communities more resilient, the state legislature created a grant program that has a few different eligible activities, but there's a real priority for the program on helping property owners leave flood-prone properties and converting their land to open space like wetlands or recreational areas that can help absorb floodwater, but also serve as open space amenities that make the community a more attractive and enjoyable place to live. And from 2002 to 2016, the program funded buyouts of 140 structures. So this reduced risk for homeowners. It also opened up land to serve these really important purposes. And the other program, this category that I'll talk about, is the Washington Floodplains by Design program. So in 2013 in Washington, the state legislature supported the creation of a public-private partnership called Floodplains by Design that included several stakeholders in the state to address the root cause of flooding in Washington, which includes the manipulation of Washington's rivers and development in the floodplains. The partnership takes a collaborative approach to mitigation projects, and it awards grants to support projects that restore rivers and their floodplains, sometimes by removing dams and other man-made systems that aren't really operating effectively anymore. And since 2013, the state has made a significant investment through this program, awarding more than $115 million to cities, tribal governments, and other entities for floodplain projects through grants. And there's actually an additional $50 million that's been approved for the next grant cycle. The next category that I'll talk about is creating new revenue sources for flood mitigation. And in this category, we have the policy that I'll talk about first is the Iowa Flood Mitigation Program, another program that has led to a really significant amount of investment, which tracks to the damages that the state has seen over the past several decades from flooding. In 2008, for example, devastating floods across the Midwest left Iowa with an estimated $10 billion in damage. And as the state recovered, policymakers realized that this is a problem that had to be addressed through more forward-looking programs, and they use a portion of federal disaster assistance to create a pilot program focused on watershed level solutions that sort of transcend political and jurisdictional boundaries. The pilot served as a basis for a competitive grant award, and that led to a long-term strategy with long-term funding identified to combat flood risk. And these funding mechanisms included a local sales tax for communities that are seeking to reduce damage. In the course of just a few years, as of October 2017, Iowa had approved 10 projects at a cost of $1.4 billion, with a significant amount of it, 600 million almost, not 596 million, coming from sales tax revenue, 360 million from more local dollars, and then 425 million from federal funds. And these are investments that are paying off. In Dubuque City, for example, there was a cost or investment of 200 million, but the city is estimating that the project is going to ultimately prevent 582 million in future damage. In Maryland, we feature a low-interest loan for living shoreline. So this is basically a revolving fund that involves the state giving loans for living shoreline projects that restore shorelines in a natural way to counter erosion of the shoreline, but also reduce associated flooding. And this is a real issue in Maryland, which has 7,000 miles of shoreline. And since its inception in 2011, this shore erosion control loan program has distributed nearly $3 million in loans for 475 projects, and it's protected over 200,000 linear feet of shoreline. And then the last category that we found these policies fall into is regulations, establishing smart regulations to drive less risky development. In a small town called Brevard in North Carolina, this is actually one of the wettest places in the country, second only to the Pacific Northwest, due to combined heavy rains and tropical storms, along with the town's topography. And to reduce vulnerability to flooding, the City Council adopted what is one of the nation's strongest regulations on construction in the floodplain. This is a no adverse impact certification. The regulations require no new developments or structural improvements in the floodplain that would increase flood risk for other property owners nearby in the floodplain or nearby communities. And the regulations have, because of how FEMA's community resilience rating program works, the CRS program run by FEMA, and how it interfaces with FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program, residents who are at flood risk actually have seen their flood insurance rates go down 10%. So they're paying less regardless of whether a storm or disaster happens. They're paying less in premiums. And then the last policy I'll talk about, also in this regulations group, is a Norfolk resilience zoning change that has just happened in the last year. So Norfolk, as you're probably aware, has really bad flood problems due in part to sea level rise, which is really increasing the city's flood vulnerability. There's over 200 miles of shoreline, and in recent decades, sea level rise, along with changing precipitation patterns, have led to recurring flooding. In 2013, officials decided that Norfolk's zoning ordinance needed to be overhauled, and this would be an effective way to address the flood problem and promote safer development. And the city updated its zoning ordinance to account for these threats. So this, over the course of really 4 years, the city worked to revise this ordinance and released it in January of last year. It includes requirements to encourage investment in less risky areas. And they created a scoring system called a resilience quotient that, again, through their zoning laws, encourages development in areas with lower flood risk. And so those are the policies that I'm going to cover. Again, there are 13 policies, and we found a number of lessons learned across them. And Sarah Edwards from Pew is going to walk you through a few of those.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Edwards, and like Matt said, I also work on the Flood Prepared Communities Initiative here at Pew, and I'm going to walk us through some of the lessons learned through this report. So in addition to researching the nuts and bolts of the policies and capturing the range of policies across different parts of the country, we also analyzed trends across these policies. So these are takeaways that apply broadly to mitigation efforts and factors that led to successful implementation. So the first lesson that I'll talk about is investment in planning. Many decision makers that we talked to in these conversations attributed the success of their programs to work and investments made on the front end of policy development. So while they definitely had strong compulsion to get shovels in the ground as quickly as possible, many of these communities after the fact felt that they experienced higher payoffs because they dedicated their first steps into the planning process. Gaining that understanding of what the drivers of your flood risk are and then identifying the critical vulnerabilities really helped to identify strategies for a couple of these decision makers and resulted in greater positive impact. So one community that did this is South Holland. It's a small suburb of Chicago, and the policy that they used was a rebate program that helped residents retrofit their homes to be better equipped to deal with flood risk. But this policy came about after a flood committee formed way back in 1994 to figure out why their residents kept suffering from the impacts of floodwaters. The community assessed the components of the area that exacerbated the flood conditions, and then they identified potential methods to alleviate. They looked at the options in front of them and ultimately decided that the rebate program to provide financial assistance to homeowners in order to improve their stormwater systems and their sewer systems. And as a result, when we talked to the program manager in South Holland, he reported that he was noticing that as residents continued to take advantage of the rebate, homes were experiencing less flooding. So he was grateful for the attention to detail that the flood committee put in place back in 1994 and attributed the success of the program to their efforts. Another lesson that we pulled from a couple of these profiles were just the importance of cost-effective options. I don't think it's any news to anybody here that funds are probably limited when you're looking to invest in mitigation. But one way to overcome this could be through using cost shares to leverage other funding sources, either using federal sources to drive private investment or using state and local cost shares to distribute the burden. Another cost-effective tool is regulatory options. These don't require the same amount of upfront money. They don't require kind of a big pot sitting in front of you, but can still be very effective. Matt talked a good about this category with Brevard and with Norfolk, and I'll just touch on one other example in Fort Collins, Colorado. Sorry. So Fort Collins, they use floodplain regulations to encourage development in less risky areas, or alternatively, they require greater elevation if they're going to develop in the floodplain. The standards are pretty robust because they cover the 1% annual flood chance and the 0.2% annual flood chance floodplains. The city also placed prohibitions on critical facilities in the floodplains, recognizing that the community's reliance on facilities and that the inundation of these facilities exacerbates the strain that a flood event creates. So between the implementation of these regulations and then a severe flood in 2013, there was a total of 14,000 structures that were built. Of those 14,000, only 8 experienced flood damage. The next lesson that I will cover is going to be talking about the importance of natural solutions. Many areas with high flood risks are also areas that have filled in wetlands and disconnected their floodplains. And policies that reverse these manipulations are taking advantage of the natural and beneficial functions of nature in order to absorb excess waters. Some of these can be large-scale river restoration projects. Others, like Milwaukee, use an accumulation of smaller natural features to create an impact. So Milwaukee is a well-urbanized area, and they use a series of planning initiatives and support tools to increase the green infrastructure in the area in order to capture rainwater and avoid flooding from overwhelmed sewer systems. Through these planning efforts, they created a long-term goal of using green features to build capacity in order to capture the first half-inch of rainwater, what equates to 740 million gallons of water. And they set the goal to do this by 2035. This initiative is also addressing some of their water quality issues, which is highlighting some of the co-benefits to the city for its investment. All right, the next lesson that I'll talk about is the importance of communicating the benefits. A number of our profiles show the importance of communicating benefits, and this applies to stakeholders, residents, legislators, the list goes on. But being able to quantify benefits builds support for the policy that you're trying to achieve, and then justifies continued investments in the mitigation program so it can have a long lifespan. Minnesota did this by investing in a study. The policy uses a series of bonds, which is financed with a gas tax, and they used that funding to invest in the resiliency of their roadways. They were really looking at the flood vulnerability in their transportation sector. So Minnesota Department of Transportation, they took on this flood mitigation program in order to target roadways that they had identified as being the most vulnerable to flooding. Through the study, Minnesota was able to quantify the economic impact of road closures due to flooding. So Highway 101 was one that came up as being a critical roadway and a very vulnerable roadway. It was closed for a total of 43 days in 2010, and then another 43 days in 2011. In this study, the department assessed the impact of that closure, and it calculated it out to be $274,000 per day that the road was closed. The bridge highway was a primary connector between two counties. So through the engagement process, the St. Francis Hospital, which was a major employer in the area, reported that an estimated quarter of their staff relied on this bridge highway. So the department's ability to quantify the vulnerability of the highway and do an economic analysis of that impact and communicate with stakeholders, all of that combined created a justification to invest in this roadway and other roadways similar to it. So the project was supported by employers at the hospital, and it also brought in additional funding sources, including local and federal resources. So the last takeaway that I want to highlight is from policies that really turned lemons into lemonade. We can acknowledge that the best time to invest in mitigation is probably going to be before the flood strikes, but that's definitely easier said than done. It can be difficult to build momentum and political will outside of flood events. But some places like Vermont and Iowa and Norfolk, they use the recovery stage of devastating floods to start looking at forward-looking policies that would reduce impacts of the next flood. So Matt talked a little bit about Iowa and the structure of their program and their use of the sales tax. But I just want to retouch on Iowa to highlight the fact that they were hit hard in 2008. Matt indicated this, an estimated $10 billion in damage. And as the state recovered, policymakers leveraged the disaster funding and turned that into long-term policies. So like he said, they used a pilot program that focused on watershed level mitigation efforts and brought together stakeholders, including farmers, business folks, local, state, and federal decision makers, and they all collaborated as they were investing in mitigation projects. And this pilot program turned into a larger program fueled by both research institutions, stakeholder engagement, and legislative support. But all of that spurred out of their ability to look at forward-thinking mitigation efforts in the aftermath of a disaster. But with that, that summarizes our lessons learned here. So these are takeaways from studying 13 policies. As a reminder, the full report and each of the profiles are available on our website, pewtrust.org/mitigation matters. We also have an event coming up in New York on December 10th, and that's looking specifically at funding and financing of these mitigation activities. We have an invitation. Maybe Martina will be kind enough to help us send that around for anybody that might be interested. New York's a little ways away, but it could be worth the trip. And then lastly, if you're interested in any of our other work, you can email Forbes Tompkins. His email is on your screen, and he will loop you into our quarterly emails. But right now, I'm also going to turn it over to Sean Houton in our Government Relations Department, and he's going to talk about some of how we're using this research and what we've learned here, and what that translates to for Virginia, and what next steps could be for Virginia looking at mitigation efforts.
Thanks, Sarah. Again, I'm Sean Houton with Government Relations at Pew. As Sarah referenced, oftentimes the research that we conduct and put out can inform and be tied to advocacy that we conduct both at local, state, and federal levels. In particular, I want to talk about some of our research and how it's informed advocacy within the state of Virginia, focusing on, as Matt referenced, two of the buckets that we're focused on, specifically pre-disaster mitigation, as well as nature-based solutions being a complement to or when appropriate, supplanting sort of, quote, more man-made or gray mitigation efforts. So according to the Virginia Hazard Mitigation Plan, flooding, and that's a product that the state has to put out pursuant to the Federal Stafford Act as a condition for receiving certain types of non-emergency disaster assistance. Flooding is the top hazard across Virginia, impacting residents, businesses, and infrastructure from the tidewater to the Appalachians. Over the last 40 years, the National Flood Insurance Program, or NFIP, has paid out more than $700 million to Virginians covered by the program that have incurred flood damages. Flood damages arise from events big and small, but in the past decade, there have been 7 federally declared disasters relating to flooding, and over the past 20 years, there's been a 250% increase in overall federally designated disasters. As was referenced by my colleagues, with the impacts of climate change, such as sea level rise and the increase in the frequency and intensity of extreme weather, the likelihood of flood disasters and their resulting costs are expected to increase in the future. So one of the key ways that trying to deal with the projected costs of floods, it underscores the need to act now to mitigate those impacts. As Matt referenced, the 2018 study by the National Institute of Building Sciences found that every dollar spent on mitigation projects writ large that were designed to reduce the impact of future events saved an average of $6 in disaster costs. The study also went more granular, as the map that we provided earlier, to the benefits for particular states, but also for specific types of disasters. And in Virginia, the study found that the average return on disaster mitigation was for every $1, at least $6.40. And for flood mitigation specifically in the state, it was higher for $1 to $6.55 in average benefits. And studies that the state has done itself, corroborate this. In 2015, the Virginia Department of Emergency Management put out a study that looked at $46 million invested in flood mitigation projects, which were projected to result in nearly $184 million dollars in future losses and damages avoided. In terms of mitigation, as was referenced, Pew is particularly interested in encouraging so-called nature-based solutions that leverage the flood mitigation properties of maintaining, restoring, and enhancing marine ecosystems. Other studies that we've observed have shown that so-called green infrastructure can be more cost-effective than traditional armoring methods. In 2018, one study quantitatively compared the cost-effectiveness of natural and artificial flood reduction measures along the U.S. Gulf of Mexico coast, concluding that green options are economically viable for preventing storm damage in coastal communities, often being more cost-effective. For example, the estimated comparison of wetland restoration is more than $8 in direct flood reduction benefits for every $1. Similarly, with oyster reef restoration, it was a $7 to $3 benefit estimate. By contrast, levees provided no net benefits, a 1-to-1 cost to benefit, whereas other activities such as elevation of homes and other property, the cost exceeded the benefits 40 cents to $1. Returning to the Virginia Hazard Mitigation Plan, the Commonwealth is well aware and have acknowledged the importance of mitigation, but has also acknowledged some fundamental challenges, funding for one. As the plan indicates, when adequately staffed and funded, these pre-disaster mitigation programs are comprehensive and extremely effective in reducing the effects of natural hazards. However, during the past 2 decades, state and federal budget challenges, full funding and staffing of programs has been rare. Localities have had difficulty developing cost-effective projects and or coming up with the non-federal cost share to take advantage of these opportunities. So, one of the lessons from our Mitigation Matters report has trying to find sound mechanisms for, funding mitigation projects. And one particular arising from Indiana is using what's called a revolving loan fund to fund mitigation projects. Typically, a revolving loan fund program provides low or no interest loans to state and local entities that can be used for a range of public purposes, including flood mitigation, as well as other examples for land conservation and drinking water. Following initial investments in dollars, ultimately, as the loans are repaid, the fund is replenished, and those dollars can be made available for new projects. And as I mentioned, one of the case studies that we've looked at is Indiana's flood control revolving loan fund. Indiana has a long history of devastating floods, from one in 1937 that caused 1 million people to become homeless and costing $3.3 billion in today's dollars, to another recently in 2008 that destroyed over 25,000 homes. This repeated history of flood disasters informed the state's establishment of a flood control revolving fund in the 1950s, which provides, again, low interest loans to local entities to mitigate flood risk. And it's noteworthy that it's exclusively using state funds as opposed to federal grant dollars. To be eligible for the state's flood control fund, localities must show in their application that the project will benefit its communities. It may include removing debris from waterways, clearing, straightening, creating new or enlarging streams, or building or repairing flood-protected projects such as levees, as well as establishing floodways. Here's a chart that's showing sort of the revolving nature of this kind of fund. Under the fund, applicants can borrow up to $250,000 and choose between a 2% interest rate for 1 to 5 years or 2.5% rate for 5 to 10 years. Particular loans are often small, but they can be critical for communities that lack access to other resources. One area that we looked at was in the town of Mecca in Park County, Indiana. It received $55,000 in loans in 2017 to update a storm sewer. This community had 400 people, and had suffered significant frequent flooding because parts of the drainage system were more than 100 years old, in poor condition, and subject to clods and backways. Severe flooding had damaged homes and restricted roads, cutting residents off from critical facilities and emergencies, and caused health and safety concerns. So in terms of that providing an analog for Virginia work, we're advocating essentially to establish a similar revolving loan fund in Virginia. Our priorities include securing $50 million in seed money for pre-disaster mitigation, emphasizing community-level projects for holistic planning, as well as prioritizing nature-based solutions to enjoy mitigation benefits as well as other ecosystem services. And one particular route we could take is amending Virginia's Shoreline Resiliency Fund, which the General Assembly in Virginia, overwhelming bipartisan majorities, enacted into law and was signed by then Governor McAuliffe. The intent of it was forward-thinking, looking to establish a program to provide mitigation resources to help communities and individuals reduce flood risk, similar to the Indiana Fund. Unfortunately, at this point, there has yet to be that so-called seed money invested into the fund, so consequently, the program remains dormant. Again, critical to the program getting off the ground is kickstart funding, which will then trigger the state to develop guidelines and solicit and implement projects that can demonstrate flood risk reduction and enhance natural infrastructure. We're working with a diverse stakeholder group, including conservation organizations, business associations, neighborhood advocates, to request, again, about $50 million in funding for the program. In terms of the initial statute that was enacted, we're also looking at potential tweaks, again, to prioritize neighborhood scale activities, as well as to encourage, again, as a complement or replacement to gray infrastructure, nature-based or green infrastructure. And also, just sort of a branding issue, it's called Virginia Shoreline Resiliency Fund, which sort of connotes that it has a coastal focus. The actual legislative language applies to across Virginia, so interested in making technical tweaks to help clarify that for interested parties. So thank you for your time, and we're happy to answer any questions across our presentation.
All right, thank you guys. And Sarah, I'm happy to send out that email information about the invitation to the event in New York City. For those attending who may not be aware of this, we do send an email out post-webinar that includes any follow-up information that our presenters share with us and want to distribute, as well as the link and CM credit information for today's webinar. So we will get that out later today once the webinar has been posted. If anybody has any questions, you can go ahead and type them in the question box, and I will read them to our presenters. We don't have anything at the moment, but we'll give it a minute and see if anybody has any follow-up questions. All right, I have a question. Has anyone tackled the issue of urban flooding and redeveloping suburbs?
Well, in our Mitigation Matters research, we certainly came across some examples of significant urban flooding. One example that comes to mind is Milwaukee's green infrastructure initiatives, which Sarah talked a little bit about. And this is a major U.S. city that has seen such a bad flood problem that they invested in green infrastructure initiatives across the city, and have really invested a significant amount of money tied to very forward-looking and ambitious goals for the amount of water that the city is able to absorb through these green infrastructure measures. There are open spaces and various forms of vegetation that the city has invested in, and the amount of water that they are absorbing has increased really significantly over the past decade or so, where, initially they had set a goal of absorbing, a few billion gallons of stormwater. And now, as of this year, they've set a goal to absorb 50 billion gallons of water across the city. So I'd say that's one example. I think that, we really found that all different types of localities and cities and states are struggling with this issue and really looking for ideas. So that's why our research has formed this menu of options that can be used for whether you're talking about urban flooding, large urban areas like Milwaukee, or smaller areas like the South Holland, Illinois rebate example that's also featured in our research, but also, more rural areas. I'd say Arkansas is an example of that, one that we didn't talk so much about, but in that state, they developed a tax credit to reward people who are investing in restoring and creating wetlands that have associated flood mitigation benefits. I'll stop there, but I don't know, Sarah, did you have anything to?
No, I think that's exactly right.
All right, we have another question. Has anyone at Pew examined the potential impacts of Virginia's recently enacted constitutional amendment that now provides localities the option of providing a partial real estate tax exemption for properties that have undertaken flood mitigation measures?
It's a great question. I think that with that constitutional amendment, a lot of that comes down to how cities, towns, counties, localities implement that. There's a lot of room, to decide what the parameters are for that tax incentive. So we have not necessarily taken a hard look at it yet, kind of, waiting to see what localities pick it up, and hoping that maybe, we can be a resource to those localities, and looking at how some of these policies can translate to making that an effective effort. One of our policies, I don't think we touched on it here, is a tax incentive in the state of Arkansas for donating, restoring, or maintaining a wetland. Applies to any riparian landowners who dedicates their land for a natural wetland space. So seeing maybe Virginia take steps towards something like that would be, we would support that. But yeah, in terms, like I said, the constitutional amendment, I think right now there's a lot of room for how it can be used, and so we're happy to work with any cities or localities to figure out the most effective way to take advantage of that opportunity.
Okay, we did have somebody just submit a comment. South Holland, Illinois is a suburb of Chicago. Maybe that will help, I guess, with the attendee with the last question or previous question, point the attendee in the right direction. So I just want to share that piece. Any recommendations for how federal policy could be improved to support state and local communities in implementing mitigation measures?
Sure. I mean, I think that, I touched on a few ideas and initiatives that have been launched in recent years by the federal government. We really think that this is a problem that is only going to be better addressed through partnership between different levels of government, certainly including the significant resources that the federal government has to offer. So there is the Disaster Recovery Reform Act that was passed last year and has created the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities grant program that is run by FEMA and is going to likely direct better resources from the federal government to help localities afford flood mitigation projects. Another idea at the federal level that has been proposed in Congress a few times, starting in 2017 in both the House and the Senate, is a state revolving loan fund for flood mitigation. We've talked about a few revolving funds at the state level today during this presentation, but this would actually be a federal revolving loan fund that would involve the federal government giving grants to help set up funds in states across the country, and then the states would administer those revolving loan funds. So they'd basically be seeded by the federal government. States would put up matching dollars, and then that fund would be used for various loans across the state to communities that want to do projects for flood mitigation. So this is an idea that has gained traction. I would say in the last year, Maxine Waters included it in her bill for reforming the National Flood Insurance Program. And so we're really excited about that proposal. We think it represents a great form of partnership, potentially between the federal government and states on mitigations. I would say that is, an additional idea for people who are listening, maybe if they haven't heard about that, to visit Pew's website. We definitely have a lot of information about it. And maybe we could include a link or two in the email that's sent out after the presentation, if people are interested in learning more.
Okay, great. It looks like those are all the questions we have at the moment. If anybody has any last questions, send them our way. And if we do get any questions following the presentation, we'll be happy to share them with the team at Pew and follow up with individuals who have those questions. Sarah and Matt and Sean, thank you so much for being with us today and presenting. And as always, if you all have any information that you would like us to share with attendees, including that invitation, we'll get that out in our follow-up email later this afternoon. But otherwise, we look forward to seeing everybody on our next webinar on December 16th. Remember, it's a week early due to the Christmas holiday. And all of our webinars can be found at virginia.planning.org. Thank you so much for attending, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.